people gathered in the crowd, Jesus said to them, "This generation is an evil generation. It seeks a sign, but no sign will be given it, except the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. At the judgment, the Queen of the South will rise with the men of this generation, and she will condemn them, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And there is something greater than Solomon here. At the judgment, the men of Nineveh will arise with this generation and condemn it. Because of the preaching of Jonah, they repented. There is something greater than Jonah here." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
As we continue to read through this letter from St. Paul to the Galatians, again, the main topic he is discussing is about the Judaizing heresy. Right? So one of the central questions of the church at the beginning of her time was how Gentiles were to be brought into the faith. Did they only need to be baptized, or did they only need to have faith? Did they need to practice the ceremonial rituals of Judaism in the Old Testament? And this whole letter to the Galatians is basically St. Paul making his claim about what is needed. And of course, he says that the old laws from the Old Testament are no longer required, that baptism replaces circumcision, and new Christians don't have to follow all of the dietary and ritual laws of the Old Testament. And as I've been explaining over the last few days, or the last few times we've had daily Mass, is the rationale behind this. And it's a key understanding, is that many times when we think about the Bible and we think about the Old Testament, we think about it as like a gradual progression, culminating with the appearance of Jesus. But that's not really what the story of the Old Testament is like. It's more like a bunch of mountains and then valleys. That God makes a covenant, or God makes promises to his people, and then the people, out of their disobedience and infidelity, right, they fall out of that covenant, or they fall out of that relationship. And the whole point of what St. Paul is trying to say in this letter to the Galatians is that people are trying to go backwards. So basically what he's saying is that all of those Old Testament laws, the Old Testament rituals and ceremonial laws, it was not a law of freedom. It was not a familial law. It was a law of punishment. It was like a probationary period. That God at Mount Sinai, when the people of Israel arrived there, God wanted to bring the people of Israel into his family as his bride, and to make a covenant with them, a covenant among equals, you might say. But shortly thereafter, because the people fell into the sin of the golden calf, they were demoted, or they were punished, or put on probation, you might say. They went from being called to being members of the family to becoming servants and slaves, unequals. That's one of the reasons why Jesus at the Last Supper, when he established the new covenant, he said, "I no longer call you slaves, but friends," elevating the dignity of all Christians. And so St. Paul is asking these people who want to go back to these Old Testament laws, why would you wish to go back in the law of slavery and servitude? What's kind of interesting about this from a more of an academic standard is that over the last 100 years, through archaeology and through historiography and different things, scholars have actually learned a lot more about covenants in the ancient world. And it turns out that scholars have actually seen corroborating evidence for this interpretation. That basically in the ancient Near East, when people made covenants with each other, they were structured differently if it was like between two equal nations, as opposed to when a nation was conquered by another nation. It was like a covenant of servitude, or it's called a vassal treaty. And as these scholars have begun to compare these old covenant rituals with what is shown in the Old Testament, they see the same thing. That when God is making his covenants throughout the scriptures, you can clearly tell whether it was a covenant among equals or a covenant among a master and a slave. So it's corroborated this. Because the whole point of what St. Paul is trying to say in this letter is that in the New Covenant, in the New Testament, God is not calling us to be simply his slaves, but in some ways his equal. He's elevating our dignity. We become members of the family. Even the angels who have this immense dignity and power and intelligence far beyond ourselves. Yet the relationship that we have with God is so far beyond what the angels will ever experience. Because that is how powerful the covenant is that God has made with us. We're not called to live in fear and servile servitude. We are called to freedom and the fullness of life. That is why St. Paul says here, for freedom Christ has set us free, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery.